Welcome, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for joining. This is the Contentful Appnovation webinar on content that connects, building an empathetic content strategy. We're going to dive right into it because we have a very action-packed program today. I'm going to hand it off to Andii, Andrew, and Gavin to introduce themselves.
All right.
Andii.
Start. Hello, everyone. My name is Andii Davis, and I'm the Director of Strategy at Appnovation. So that essentially means that I help brands achieve their business goals by better addressing user needs.
Thank you. Gavin, welcome. Andrew, do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Kumar. I am the Director of Platform Strategy here at Contentful. I am a ex-Appnovation alumni from 7-8 years ago. So great to be connecting with Appnovation again. I'm a former Contentful customer, former Contentful implementation partner. Now I've joined the dark side. I'm really excited to help our customers and our partners build really good products and experiences in the digital space, powered by Contentful.
We're happy to have you back, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks.
Gavin, you're up.
Hi there, Gavin Estey. I'm a technical director here at Appnovation, and I like to work to help brands get the best investment out of their technology possible and to build exciting customer experiences.
Awesome. Thanks, Gavin. So before we get into anything, we're going to kick things off with our first poll of this session. So that's going to pop up on your screen. Just take a quick second to vote, and we're going to slide into segment 1, which is consumer trends and experience, the current landscape. So tech angst and screen fatigue, as we know, are on the rise. We're all experiencing this and want to feel a little bit more human connection with the brands that we engage with. But the big question is, how can brands be more empathetic in their messaging and their overall storytelling? I'm going to look to Andii to launch this one. So Andii, as we know, the art of storytelling is an age-old practice. It's part of our DNA as human beings. You know, we talk to our friends, our family, our colleagues. Our voice is animated. We're talking right now. We're full of emotion, and all that resonates with people. Some brands are naturals at storytelling. Some probably need a little bit of work. So from a brand perspective, what's the magic formula in producing content that really resonates with people, human beings?
Yeah, great question. So I would say that the marketing mindset has really shifted. So today it's much less about selling a product and more about telling that human story that you kind of touched on, right? And that's because people gravitate towards brands with substance. And we're seeing in a lot of research and a lot of studies that millennials and Gen Z really tend to favor brands that stand for something, right? And that share their values. And so that means it's really important for brands and businesses to really define that brand purpose, right? Their reason for being, what they stand for, and tell that through story. And I would mention also that what we're seeing is more and more brands are tapping into, I'll call them cultural moments, right? So that they can be more relevant. And at the same time, they're also in a way demonstrating their values and again, telling their stories. So I think those are some things to mention that are really critical. I would also say that, you know, we're talking about stories. So what is a story really? It's not just words on a page, okay? And so I think it's critical to consider what you're saying and how you say it, right? So elements like brand personality, voice and tone are critical to resonating, essentially. And I actually think that role of brand personality has become more important these days because, you know, I've seen numbers out there around the number of ads people are bombarded with in a day. I don't know if it's 5,000, I don't know if it's 10,000, but it's a big number, right? And so in that context, you're trying to break through that noise in order to connect. and really capture that attention. And so that's why I think that's an element that brands and businesses really have to pay attention to. And then one last point here, I think it's also beyond language, right? Not just the tone, but maybe the visual language, right? There are a lot of different levers that you can use to tell a story. So yes, visual design and photography style and all of that stuff all come together to create this perception, paint that picture, paint that story. And I think once you figure out those elements, then you can take a moment to zoom out and say, okay, let me consider this bigger picture. Am I telling the story in a cohesive manner and in a consistent way across all of my channels? Because to resonate, ideas really need to be reinforced. It can't just be this one and done thing.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that kind of channel mix approach, but also that words on a page isn't just your content. We consume content in many different ways. As I said, there's audio, to your point, there's visual and so on. So when we think about the channel mix, it's really easy to get caught up on those trends, like what's the latest platform to jump on? Should we do it? Should we not do it? And it's tempting. But I think what, organizations should really think about is first understanding where their audience is, where they live, where they play, and then select the right channel that's going to effectively engage with them. And part of that is breaking down that content into snack-sized pieces. So, you've got your blog, and then you've got your social, you've got your video, you've got your podcast, but breaking them down into snack-sized pieces so they're easier to digest. So, what would you say to that in terms of, how can brands be more effective in telling their story at any stage of the journey?
Right. Yes, that's a great question. So, yeah, what I talked about at first was really around that storytelling. I think when it comes to engaging with audiences and thinking about that journey, it's important to remember that, again, people don't want to be sold to. And so that means that content has to be useful and it has to matter. And that means that, you have to consider what's the right moment to engage and what's the right way to engage. So it's looking at channels and it's thinking about what are the right formats. Should I do long form content, short form, podcast, right? Like thinking through all of that, as well as, I've had a lot of conversations around what's the appropriate mix between more brand marketing content and then more of that product level content. So it's making calls at those different type of levels. And I would also say, and really critical to this as well, is how are you making your customer feel, right? Do they feel like they are the most important customer that you have? And accomplishing that through personalization, right? Which is another really important part of content and its role and the way it connects with people. So, a lot of different points in there, but I think it's really about, again, telling that human story and then using all of the elements and high impact channels to really reinforce that story, and then finding the moments and methods to really engage your audience.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. And, to everyone out there, we're going to dive into more about that personalization, some of the technology and the platforms to use. But first, I'll just kind of quickly go back to the results for the poll are in. We've got 79% have internal content teams and 21% are mixed. So it's really good to hear that a lot of you have internal teams that are working on your content, because as we dive into this webinar a little bit more, you'll see the benefits in terms of how it plays into your business objectives. So I'm going to go and hand it off to Gavin. From a tech perspective, what's your take? We talked about personalization, digital channels, devices. From a tech perspective, what do you see is missing from the empathy approach?
It's interesting that when we look at personalization, and it's become table stakes these days, everyone knows the value of personalization and looking at kind of personalization driven metrics and data-driven marketing, data-driven content. But it's really important to make sure that the metrics we're using are metrics that matter to our customer. A good example of this is if you look at recipe sites on the internet these days, there's this huge long form story, the history of someone from their childhood to when they cook their recipe, photos of their holiday in Tuscany. And it's really because they're writing for an audience that is Googlebot and not their customer. You have to dig down into the content you want. So really those wrong metrics and driving the wrong goals really hurts this kind of customer engagement and really making that connection with your customer. And when we look at personalization, sometimes it's not just about adding personalization, but the right personalization, the right touch, not pushing too hard. And really one of the kind of interesting things is when it goes wrong, like you get annoyed by bad personalization or a lack of personalization. Like for example, I buy New Balance running shoes every 6 months or so, but New Balance does not know that I'm a men's size 11. I have to go to the site. Even after I log on, it's still showing me a bunch of shoes that won't fit me. And it's these kind of little annoyances and these little pieces of friction, which really hurts the brand messaging and customer-centric journey that you're really trying to get with the content that you're creating.
Gavin, I really appreciate that because, I mean, you know, we've all probably tapped into recipes a little more in the last year than we ever have in life. And I can tell you firsthand, it is the biggest pain point. You know, I automatically go to print recipe just to get to the content because that's what I'm there for. You know, so let's talk about, you know, the platform. Andrew, our Appnovation alum, our Contentful specialist, you know, this can be daunting for brands to absorb. You know, it's a lot to take in from content strategy, effective storytelling, digital channel devices and mixes and so on. So what is your take on streamlining the approach and how can Contentful support empathy and content strategy?
Thanks, Xania. And also thanks, Andii and Gavin. I'm going to piggyback off you guys for a moment here. Andii talked about brands with substance and the brands that need to bring that content with substance to the forefront. Gavin talked about personalization. So, you know, a colleague of mine used to say sometimes personalization is just an if statement in your front end that knows a little bit more about the customer. When we start to package all of this together at Contentful, we have identified 3 key use cases where our customers have found a lot of success to really streamline and bring this type of mechanism and methodology to market. The first one is around commerce. So again, brand with substance. What we found in our research is brand information, positioning information, lifestyle information, imagery around the lifestyles, the benefits for the customer. There's 5 factors that influence cart starts and influence conversion rate before we've even started to talk about product specifications. So bringing that content to the forefront and having a content strategy in the commerce space is really, really key and really, really important. The caveat to that, though, is it really depends on the market you're in. My counterparts and my colleagues in Germany, they'll fight me on this. They'll say, hey, in Germany, the product specifications are tough. You got to bring that right to the front. So having some flexibility based on the market is also pretty important and pretty key. That's use case number 1 on how to streamline this. Use case number 2 is around knowledge bases or articles or answer engines or learning centers. It all comes down to convenience. Customers, users, they want answers fast and they want those answers where they need it. And so this is where Contentful can support authors to create that better content, but also to get the most ROI and the most delivery and reach on that content by able to put that content in web, mobile, app, voice skill, chatbots. So really helping that content get surfaced where the customers are. And then the third use case comes down to localization, global marketing, and translations. Sometimes just having a localized version of a web experience is enough to be personalized, is enough to be contextual and relevant to that audience. And then having in the ability to translate it broadly for all of your audiences that improves your brands and reach. So it's all really, really important. And you know, I'm Canadian, a few of us are Canadian. And if we think about being a national brand, and I used to work for a large telco and being national was kind of key. We had large diasporas, large audiences that needed content in Chinese simplified, Chinese traditional, Tagalog, English, Punjabi, French being our second national language. So these are all ways to personalize without being personalized, to be contextual, and things that we need to factor and consider into our content strategy to provide that empathy back to our end users.
Yeah, and that also plays into, you know, loyalty, customer loyalty. If a customer feels connected with a brand simply because they recognize where they are and the language they speak, to me in itself, that is empathy alone. And then if you can dive in deeper on that, that's a bonus. But I think just those two things that you talked about localization and translation, would resonate very deeply with an audience. We are seeing a lot of questions coming in through the chat. There is a Q&A button at the far right of the panel. So if you have any questions, please drop them in that Q&A. We're going to do our best to get to them at the end of the segments, not individual segments, but towards the end of the seminar. And we'll tackle it then. So please, if you have any questions, drop them in there. And we're going to jump into the second segment, which is, you know, content and technology. Where does it all fit in? So the trend in technology is moving towards microservices that offer more agility. We've heard the term agility a lot in the last year. Diverse and interconnected systems that can be changed relatively easy in response to changes with a focus on strong cohesion and weak coupling. So how does that all fit into building empathetic content strategy? One would typically, as a content creator, you don't always think about these things. So I'm first going to start off with Andii, because we're going to talk about very quickly what companies need to consider before they dive into their tech needs. And then we're going to segue into Gavin and Andrew to talk about tech and platform. So Andii, what do companies need to consider before they even think about tech?
Right. So I'm always the person in the room when I'm speaking to clients that says, I know we want to get excited about the technology, but let's make sure that we think from the outside in, right? So from my perspective, I think you have to first identify what is that human experience that you're trying to create, right? And then you can back into what is that technology that's going to help us get there, rather than kind of building it the reverse way, where you're thinking about just the capabilities of the latest and greatest technology and not really thinking about what you're headed towards and what you're really trying to enable. So that's my quick perspective. I'll let Gavin and Andrew around the technology.
And I think it's important, right? Like you need to think about all of that before you really think about what those tech needs are. And so Gavin, over to you. How do brands know which technology is best going to suit their needs, and how do they prioritize content management?
And I think going back to Andy's point before I answer that question is, projects that are technology led as a technology excuse to do something tend not to go so well as ones that are led from some other goals. As much as I want to implement cool technology day in and day out, but doing it for that sake rarely ends well. So we need people like Andii to kind of rein in us tech guys that get too excited about the technology and thinking about the customer. But I think kind of like looking into these things where the world has changed in several ways. We've gone from big platforms to different platforms. We've moved from this kind of having your whole architecture be one big monolith to plugging together small, useful pieces of technology as glue in your own tech stack. So I think that gives us an opportunity to swap in things, swap out things that aren't so working, but also be more experimental. If you're developing a big system that encompasses everything, you can't fail. If you're only developing a small microservice, that can fail. You can run some experiments and decide that it's not going the way you want it to go. So really that kind of data-driven A/B testing kind of concept can be applied to both the front end and to the back end. What things work, do more of those things, like switch out the things, and don't be afraid to have teams move at different velocities. Your content team and your personalization team can move at different speeds than your commerce team or the guys are responsible for fulfillment. All of these kind of different velocities can kind of be meshed together with microservices and other modern architecture to give a seamless, great user experience.
Yeah, and I think that A/B testing is really good to point out, Gavin, because it can really help brands understand how effective their content strategy is and where they can course correct along the way.
Right. That's the thing. Like, you want to be able to course correct, you want to be able to make changes, and you want to be able to go from big bang ideas to small iterative ideas and kind of lean thinking around those concepts.
We're going to talk a little bit, disruption in the environment, disruption in the world, in the marketplace, what that landscape is. And when I say disruption, it's how can we be more agile? How can we add speed to the story? So, speed and agility are those incredible important factors that as content creators, we need to think about. The world is changing daily, expectations are changing daily, behaviors are changing daily now. And so that need for speed is very real. And not only creating an empathetic content strategy, but also the effectiveness and reliability of our tech platforms that we choose to use. So Andrew, with speed and agility in mind, talk to us a little bit about how Contentful can support integration with other software and how to stay flexible and agile.
Thanks, Xania. So I'm biased, right? I'm not Contentful. I'll put that out there. Underlying principles of our platform is we separate the delivery of content from the management of content. So the delivery is how fast does it get in the channels, where can it be pulled from? And we're very proud of our delivery infrastructure. It's extremely fast, extremely reliable. We're looking at under 50 millisecond response times. Our APIs are all tapped into our delivery infrastructure. This is really important when it comes to reliability, scalability, and extensibility, to make sure that this content makes it to all of the markets and makes it to the customers and users as fast as possible. And it's a pretty big differentiator between us and the other platforms that are in market. Gavin talked about the legacy hybrid monolith platforms. They really struggle with these types of delivery mechanisms, and our end customers or end users, they get dinged with page speed performance and SEO. They get knocks off of their score because they're just not fast enough or not accessible enough. So that's one key consideration. On the flip side, our management infrastructure, we have this notion of speed, flexibility, extensibility, scale. These are our value pillars where we want to be able to build features and functions and support into our platform to support our users. So we've done something called an app framework. So an app framework allows for very flexible modular extensions and integrations with other different types of systems. So if you have a customer data platform that gives you a 360 view of a customer, we could bring that data into Contentful. So a content author can then say, okay, I know Xania likes this type of experience, Gavin wears this type of shoes, Andii is looking at these types of recipes, and I can create content that's very tailored to each of those different types of humans. That's one key area. We also have a really strong API and GraphQL ecosystem. So if there's a technical team that now needs to say, okay, I need to get content I know Xania's come in because I have her UUID, but I actually need to figure out what segment she belongs into. That's an API call. Okay, and now I need to know what content is relevant to Xania, that go to Contentful, and our APIs and our connectors all facilitate that type of experience in under 200 milliseconds. So that combination of speed not only being a performance factor, but also the integrations and the ability to bring the tools along. This is why our customers are able to get to market in 30, 60, 90 days with partners like Appnovation, where the other platforms, you're looking at a 12-month roadmap or an 18-month roadmap to get your first experience at the door. It's completely different consideration, and the value is accelerated that much.
I think that timeline to me that you mentioned, the Appnovation Contentful partnership, that to me, biases aside, is extremely fast. I mean, to be able to do something that in a very short period of time, I mean, if you're thinking about an 18-month runway to build something like that, your whole content strategy has been reshifted, because we're looking at these things so quickly and so frequently these days. So I love the fact that you mentioned how quick that integration can happen and how that can be built. We're gonna pause very quickly for our second poll of the session. The question is, was your content strategy incorporated into your digital transformation? So we'll give people a moment to respond to that, that question or that poll question. And I'll intro very quickly our third segment for today, which is over the last year, digital transformation, where are we headed? So over the last year, for obvious reasons, digital transformation has been adopted at lightning speed with no sign of slowing down. And companies need to build business objectives into their content strategy, as well as technology to support global messaging. Some organizations need to have content strategies, some actually don't. And it hurts my heart. It's a lot for people to wrap their head around, especially if they've fallen behind. So companies might feel a little overwhelmed, being left behind, but it's critical to stay current, maintain, and continuously evolve. You've got to think about pivoting with new technology, new trends, and cultural shifts, as we talked about already. Then how do we effectively factor in the speed and agility into the process, from updating your homepage and your landing pages and so on, and learning or iterating from failure in order to innovate? So the question that I've got here is, Andii, it's tempting to make massive changes and expect huge impact. That's natural, right? But what's your advice on digital transformation now and for future growth? What should businesses focus on, and what challenges might they face along the way?
Okay, well, good question. So I think I'll answer that maybe in three parts. So I think the first thing, since I'm very consumer focused, I think it's interesting to touch first on the role of digital and consumer expectations around it, right? And partly this is top of mind because Appnovation recently released this research report that we did about these dynamics in the market and what's been happening. And so one of the things that really stood out to me out of that report was this fact that 50% of millennials switched to new brands during the pandemic because of the way that they were using technology. And I thought that was a pretty significant number, right? And so, in addition to that, we also found that now the expectations going forward for the digital experiences that brands create, they're high. And consumers just expect brands to continue to move forward in this direction. And so, I mean, it's kind of saying what we all know, digital is really important, right? And it plays a significant role in choice and connection, right? And experience. So that's the first part. I think then, how does digital relate to content? Content is a driver of experience. And so we have to think about digital as that enabler. And as I talked about earlier, personalization, and Gavin talked about that as well. And, how does digital help create that personalized content experience? And, that need for refreshing content and keeping consumers engaged. And so again, that need for speed and agility, as you kind of spoke about earlier. So, that's how the pieces fit together. When you're talking about digital transformation, because you also talked about that, I think most companies have started this journey, right? It's more of a question of where they fall on the scale in terms of their digital maturity. And so, I think that's what companies are starting to look at and consider. And as they kind of continue on that journey, one of the biggest challenges that I've found, and sometimes it's because it's not the focus and it's overlooked, is that people aspect, right? I feel like that's really the challenge when it comes to digital transformation and making sure that, everyone's moving along in terms of their mindset and their understanding of what's happening, their habits, behaviors, and capabilities, of course. Yeah. So that's kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, I agree. We've got the poll results in from the question, what was your content strategy incorporated into your digital transformation? And we've got 67% yes, so that's great to hear. 22% said no. we should talk. And 11% no strategy. They do not have a strategy. So, you know, listen as we go along, because you'll understand as we continue talking how important, you know, not just having your content strategy is, but also, you know, factoring in digital transformation and business objectives into your content strategy and how it's going to play a bigger role. You know, back to the segment, Gavin, same question to you from a technical perspective, you know, but digital transformation.
I think the most interesting thing about digital transformation is that it's not a one and done process. It's not like you can do a digital transformation and then you are a digital company. It is a iterative process where you should always be you should always be transforming. You should be changing every day. And I look at that as kind of the two steps. Is you want to have this iterative process that we've talked about before, where you are a little bit better every day, but at the same time you want to have the ability to take advantage of changes and shifts in the market and make those predatory leaps forward. Just like Apple did with the iPod, there's something new that you don't know about today, which could change your whole industry, change how you do business. And companies that are ready to take that leap will always be better positioned about those that can't. And a lot of this comes to agility, but small a agility, not big A agility, big A agile. I think everyone talks about agile these days, but often we are agile, but not really with any agility. So it's about how we can build in change into our DNA. How can we have this continual transformation process? And how can we, like Andii said, get the right combination of people, tech, and processes in place, and use some of the concepts from software engineering. Software did eat the world after all, and have agile marketing, agile content, and a generally agile organization.
Awesome. Andrew, you're up. How does Contentful play into digital transformation? I'm sure you have a lot to say on this.
I'll try to keep it short in the interest of time. But generally, so when we talk about digital transformation and kind of the root and where it's coming from, there is this notion that at the underpinnings, it's an approach or an initiative to build better software faster. So I'm going to key in on build. And the reason we say build, and we have this whole notion of a builder ethos, is the experiences, what you're putting in front of your customers, it can't be bought, it can't be acquired. If it can be bought, your competition will buy it, and they'll put it in front of the same customer base, and everyone just gets into this battle to the bottom, and that's not good. It needs to be built, designed, executed with the right content strategy. Otherwise, there's no intellectual properties, there's no differentiator. Everything becomes commoditized. So having that builder mindset is really, really key. When I talk about I'm going to key in on the word better. This requires context. It requires an understanding of the user. It also there has to be some quality and accessibility standards around how you are leveraging what you know about the customer and providing them what they need, when they need it, when they want it, right? And has to be anticipatory, and it's pretty key given. And Andii talked about the expectations that our customers and users want. I'm going to key in on the word software. So software can mean many things, but ultimately we are in a digital space. So we're talking about websites, applications, experiences, mobile devices, connected software, smart car, smart home, smart everything, right? That's the industry, and that's what we're building for our customers and our users. So we want to be able to build that software. And then faster. So we've already talked about the speed to market, the ability to do A/B testing, but also there's this notion of fixes and remediation and technical debt. So having those mechanisms available. So under that realm, Contentful proves to be quite central in digital transformation initiatives. I've been involved in 8 digital transformation initiatives in my career. 7 of them have had Contentful in the mix as an underpinning to accelerate those initiatives and to help my clients build better software faster to get better results and to support their customers' evolving needs and objectives.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I love how both tech and platform and strategy are bringing together the whole notion of connecting people at the right place and at the right time with the right messaging. And I think, it really does tie it all together in terms of how important the strategy is, the tech is, and the platforms are, in the mixes that you're using to be effective in bringing an empathetic approach to your content strategy, because they all are interconnected. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Andrew. Thank you. We're going to transition into our fourth and final segment for today. So this is, the big chunk, building a content strategy. So earlier we mentioned throughout this talk about building business objectives into content strategy and how it supports global messaging, but how does it tie in with building an empathetic content strategy? We've learned a little bit about how technology and effective platform like Contentful all feed into the strategy and empathy, but empathy isn't an afterthought. Tech shouldn't be an afterthought, and your platform shouldn't be an afterthought. Content strategy and empathy is all part of the DNA of content strategy. It's how we as human beings should approach communication and messaging with empathy. We're talking to fellow human beings. Content supports, brand awareness, lead generation, conversion. It can attract past customers. It improves SEO. So Gavin, I'm gonna look to you in terms of how is technology embedded in content strategy?
Good question. I think oftentimes brands and companies think about the content creation and the content management. Like content was like a tricky thing to get their hands around, and it has to be managed and wrangled. And I think the more important thing is getting that content out there into the world, like the focus on distribution and reuse, and finding interesting ways to remix, reuse, use techniques like atomic content, try and get every single cent of value extracted from your investment in that content. And that's where tech can really come along. It's about unlocking that investment through personalization, through distribution, and really kind of getting it out there to the customer and really driving that customer experience.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, a platform like Contentful, how does that now support content strategy and empathetic content strategy?
Right. So we have this kind of, and a former colleague of mine would champion this internally, that content is the DNA of digital. So Contentful's role in that is to streamline, automate, and provide content strategists, content authors, developers, designers, kind of that product squad, the ability to optimize and eliminate some of the pain points. And where we play a really strong, play to our strength is around storage, authoring, management, and delivery of that content to multiple channels and multiple experiences. In order to achieve that, we have a really good learning services team and a lot of online training material on how to do content modeling. Also, Forrester talks about this notion of packaged business capabilities, and we have this notion of spaces, so you can divide and conquer and store content in these repositories to achieve specific business capabilities in a really neat and elegant way. This is where our platform and Contentful really plays to our strength and supports that content strategy and the creators of that content strategy.
Yeah, and I love that. As someone who's leading content strategy in teams, knowing that there's a platform that effectively kind of houses that content and knows and can anticipate and gives us those prompts in order to disseminate that content, I think is so helpful, because typically everything is done manually, or organizations tend to approach it with a very manual lens. And having that part of that, automated, and having the repository, I think really speaks to how things can be more agile and more responsive. Andii, what's your advice on how brands can build a stellar content strategy and build on journey mapping? I know we may have mentioned journey mapping very briefly at the top of the conversation. We're going to bring it back into this because I think it really does play a part in content strategy.
Yes, and I also like to think in frameworks, so I'm happy to talk about that. So I said at the beginning that I'm focused on business goals and user needs, right? And so when you're thinking about building your content strategy, I think you want to first start with the user, right? So start with your target audience and really get a deep understanding of what they need, right? What's going to engage them. And then that's when the business stuff comes in. You have to consider whether what you're getting them to think or feel or do is really aligned with that brand or that business goal, right? So that's kind of the setting, the background. But when you talk about journey mapping, right, to really create that content strategy and that longer term plan for yourself, I think the way to do it is, considering a few different things. So first, again, audience. Who are they? Those are the people you're trying to connect with. The second piece is where are they, right? So when it comes to the channels you should be playing in, you want to play where your audience is, right? Otherwise, you're kind of using efforts that aren't giving you a return. So where your audience is, that's where you need to be.
And it's not just the return, right? It's it's wasted effort if you are trying to spread yourself too thin on every single digital channel. You're not really effectively hitting your target audience.
Exactly. Get your bang for your buck there. And then context. So this is super important too, because you need to understand the mental model of your target audience at that moment, right? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? What are kind of they looking for when they interact with you in that moment? Because that's how you're going to start to make the connection, right? It has to be, again, relevant. It has to matter to them at that point in time. And then lastly, we cannot forget, we have to then think about what are we driving them towards? What's that intended effect? And that's how you're going to set KPIs, because we always want to do, when it comes to marketing, we want to measure the impact and make sure that everything we're doing is moving the needle, because if not, we need to regroup and tweak, right? So I think if you consider those different levels, that'll really help you to build that content strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But, Gavin, I think mentioned a few times talking about distribution, and you also talked about atomizing content a little bit. And I want to hammer home that idea about, again, reinforcing ideas by doing that atomization of content. And this is when that idea of omni-channel comes in, right? And so many people are talking about omni-channel. The value of it is that you're essentially efficiently and effectively engaging your audiences, right? When they encounter you, and then you're flowing them through to your specific goals for the user and the business, right? So that's kind of what it is. You're like telling this consistent and really considered, I think is a good word, right? Like you've thought about what you're doing. It's just not a piece of content to put something out there.
It's intentional. It serves a purpose.
Yes, exactly. As part of that bigger story. So I think that's the important part about distribution when you're thinking about content.
And when you think about organizations and how they can successfully deliver everything that we just talked about, what would you suggest companies do? And we have the poll results in terms of who has internal teams, who's outsourcing, and there's a bit of a mix. So it's a little bit scattered in terms of what people are doing. So how do organizations set themselves up for success?
Yeah, that's a great question, because just as we talked about digital transformation and people not thinking about necessarily the people aspect, I think also when you're talking about creating content, sometimes there is a plan. Some do have a plan, but then there isn't thought about how are we actually executing on that plan. And I think, I always like to say, especially like from the startup world, ideas are a dime a dozen, but execution, that's what decides who wins. And so I think you do have to consider how you want to set up an organization. And part of it is, do we have the right artifacts and templates in place, right? Like briefs and things like that. You need to make sure you have those tools. And then it's about workflows, right? Is there some kind of repeatable process that we have in place? And are we making sure that essentially it's coordinated? Because I talked about omni-channel early on, a lot of different people need to be involved in kind of this content creation and distribution across all of these channels. And so you want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So setting up planning sessions, that's super critical, right? Do you have that collaboration to create this roadmap that everyone is working towards? Do we understand the internal governance, right? So how does this all work internally, and who's responsible for what when we are deploying things from a multi-channel perspective? And I would also say, and we've talked about this a lot throughout, I think that idea of having metrics, right? You're trying to move the needle. So what are your metrics that you're tracking? And are we essentially, making sure that we're thinking about testing and learning and optimizing that content as we go along? So yes, you created a plan, but you might need to make adjustments in that plan as you kind of learn and put things out into the real world, because we all know that sometimes in organizations, we're all so close to things. And so you need to always get that feedback externally to make sure that you are actually making that connection with your audiences.
Yeah. I love everything you said. I would actually add to that, cross-departmental collaboration. I think, when you're building out your content strategy, you can't, the business objectives alone are extremely important, but understanding what each department, what their mandates are, what they're focused on, and how that can play a role in, obviously building it into your business objectives, but how that factors into your content strategy is another important factor to consider when you're building out the strategy. Otherwise, it just kind of becomes a bit of a unilateral approach to your strategy without taking in some input from other departments that obviously would need to play into that. We have 13 minutes left, just in the essence of time. I'm going to pose one last question to the panel, kind of a bit of a fire round, and then we're going to tackle some of the questions that have come in through the session. So in conclusion, to each of you, Gavin, I'll start with you first. In one sentence, what's the most important takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with today as it relates to building an empathetic content strategy?
Thank you. I think tech can really help get that message out there, but I think the most important thing is keeping your customer front and center and thinking about nudges and not pushes.
Awesome. Andrew, same question.
All right, I think having an understanding of customers, end users, their jobs to be done, like what they are for those end users. And then once we know what those jobs to be done are, leveraging the best platforms available to support not only the end users, but the content creators and the creative folks, those teams that have to build those experiences against those jobs to be done. Candidly, this is where Contentful is the best. So.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a few questions that have come in. It's kind of an open game right now. Question number one, it's easy to see how an empathetic strategy applies to B2C, but what about B2B?
All right, well, I guess I'll jump in here and then add on. I always, the approach to solving a problem for a B2C customer and a B2B client, rather, it's kind of the same approach. I think sometimes people try to make too much of a delineation. This is my personal opinion, because the people working at these businesses, people are people, they're human, right? And you still need to make connections, right? So the person you call to make a sale, it's a person. So I think, it's still important, that aspect of storytelling. I just think that when you go through that framework and you think about what's important to connect, you're probably going to emphasize different channels, right? Like different touch points. I know I was reading something recently. Thought leadership is really huge when it comes to moving the needle, when it comes to like the B2B world, right? And what a tool that marketers use, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe you'll be dialing up those pieces more than you would, let's say, for a B2C type situation. But I think that mindset and how you break down the problem and how you solve is very similar. And maybe when, I talked about brand personality at the beginning, maybe you don't have the same leeway to be too clever or too, off the wall, right? So the boundaries might be a little bit smaller, but I still think there's room for distinction and still coming across as like human, I think helps you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And chime in on Andy's point, because I think it's such a good one, is often when looking at the B2B space, people forget that the customers are really people. Like I worked on this big project and it was about plumbers ordering complicated plumbing pieces, and the big piece of feedback was make the buttons bigger because we can't click on them, like they're too small. Like getting that kind of customer feedback and really driving the conversation around people's goals instead of just being another B2B site with a generic product catalog makes such a big difference.
Yeah. And Andy, I'll echo some of what you were saying in terms of, that human approach. That also transcends into the messaging on your different channels and understanding where your audience is. And, you talked about thought leadership. And when you produce, a thought leadership piece, think about how you're going to atomize that content and then the channels that it's going to hit. If you're looking for that B2B, so to speak, to Andy's point, you are still talking to human beings, and you still want to make sure that your messaging is impactful, it's relevant, it's educational, but it also has that empathy. It has that human approach, regardless of what channel you're in. So we've got another question from Andrea. As a solopreneur, how do you balance personal brand versus company brand? So, okay, so solopreneur. So it sounds like Andrea has her personal brand, but she's also got a company brand that she's managing as an entrepreneur. How do you distinguish the two? Andy, do you think you can tackle this one? And is it a differentiation? I mean, at the end of the day, to our point, we're still talking to human beings. So would we say that part of your personal brand really is a reflection of your company brand and vice versa? Like, do you need to separate the two? Like you talked about delineation. So maybe it's bringing the two a little bit.
Well, I think it also depends on what stage your company is at, right? So I think when you're in the early stages and you're fundraising, your personal brand is really important. I think that's part of why VCs and things like that fund you, because they believe in you as the entrepreneur. So personal brand is definitely important to the story, but I think it's important to that one audience. I think when you're talking about the company you're building itself, I think it's a little bit dangerous maybe to mix the two. I mean, I think as you mature, there has to be a little bit more of a separation. I think some companies have been really successful in having the founder be kind of like the brand, right? You look at Tesla and you look at some of these other places where the founder is essentially the brand. You can see how at some points that might get messy, right? Mm-hmm. But, I think it can definitely serve as like who you are, what you stand for, what you've done, and kind of that is part of the story behind why you created this thing. So I think it's a proof point. I think it's part of the story, but I personally think that you might want to then start separating the two as you start to grow. Just my 2 cents.
Awesome. Next question, Andrew, I think this one's going to come your way. We are in the process of selecting the tools for managing and distributing our content. Any words of advice? And maybe this is a Gavin, Andrew tag team and response.
Well, I was going to say, Andrew's going to just say, pick Contentful. So next question.
So I used to be a customer, right? Like before we picked Contentful, I had to do a pretty exhaustive evaluation of all the different markets and all the different players in the market. Where we landed kind of leveraged or hinged on two levers. One was, is there a good platform, and is there a good company? And it's kind of like a Venn diagram. There are a lot of really good companies that can support enterprise scale. There's a lot of really good products and platforms that support our ability to really make our mark and use content to build those great experiences. And in the middle, there's like not that many companies. And at the time when I was a customer, it was really only Contentful. Now the market's gotten a lot better. I would bring it back to what are the evaluators or what are the criteria that is necessary when doing this evaluation. I look at things like cost or total cost of operations, not only the OpEx line item and the license fee, but also the CapEx. So what is the one-time implementation cost for a project versus the many-time implementation? And what we'll see and what we've learned is that project implementation cost goes up and up and up over time. So sometimes having something that is really key to help that CapEx line item is really good. Then we talk about things like risk reduction, flexibility, portability, what kind of upskilling is available, what is the partner ecosystem available? Like, can I tap Appnovation and say, hey, I got this project, come help me? What does that look like? There's also maintenance and operations. Some of the existing content platforms you have to host yourself, maintain yourself, worry about servers. So this is kind of where cloud is taking off. Architecture flexibility, the notion of having all of these integrations around personalization, A/B testing, AI, asset management, product information. There's a lot of different kind of variables. And then the last theme is around increasing productivity. So can you have like a meaningful impact on developer effort? Can you have a meaningful impact on content operations and a meaningful impact on time to market? When you start to look at these criteria and then evaluate the different platforms in the market, you get a really good understanding of what the right tool and the right platform for your needs are. Again, Gavin hit it on the nail. I'm going to say, hey, it's Contentful, but we do recognize Contentful is not a good fit for all customers, but for most it is.
And just to add one quick thing to that, I think that when you look at those criteria for evaluation, don't look at your existing system, look at where you want to be. A lot of companies look at trying to replicate what they have with just newer technology, and they get just a slightly better version of something they hate right now. You want to get something you love, make sure your evaluation criteria doesn't stop that happening.
I think we've got time for one more question. That one we have here is, what are some indications that our current content strategy can be optimized and improved? I love this question because it really does tie in all the components that we've talked about. But Andii, I'll hand it over to you in the essence of time. We've got a couple minutes.
Yeah, well, I'll answer some things quickly and then, chime in. I think, well, first of all, and we talked about this, I think you should always be testing and learning and optimizing, right? And so when you're looking at how your content is performing, you can look at how you're doing based on historicals. How are things performing? And how are you moving people then through the journey? And are you meeting those KPIs, right? So we talked about earlier, those metrics that you're setting at the beginning, and you're kind of seeing, how am I doing? How am I measuring up? And so I think, those are really important when it comes to optimizing. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
I think it's more the, it's also the effective digital channel mix, which we've talked about. It's not just picking one, or it's not just, embracing the whole gamut. So, and then finding the content theme so that, you're not picking apart one channel or one piece of content, and then what are the metrics on that, like kind of collectively analyze how your content is doing in increments. Any final thoughts there on that one before we kind of close, Andrew or Gavin?
So
on metrics, maybe?
On the metrics piece, so we do have a lot of third-party integration. So you could pull up your analytics suite of choice, you can surface the ID for a specific content entry into that data layer, and then your reporting team can then say, hey, this piece of content was used in these channels, accessed these many times, and has supported someone down a journey or someone down a cart start, or it's had this impact on our user base. So it can be achieved, so you know the performance of your content. And we've seen customers, I myself as a customer have brought that information all back into Contentful. So as a content author, I can say, oh, this version is doing really well. I'm going to make more content like this.
Awesome. Thank you all. And thanks to everyone who's attending. Just very quickly, we will be sharing our latest research report, The Digital Consumer, which takes a deep dive into the shifting expectations of consumers and digital readiness. And this report was actually conducted very recently, so it's very relevant to our current times right now. If you have any questions or you want to reach out to us, please send us an email at contact@appnovation.com. And on behalf of Appnovation and Contentful, thank you for attending today.